Arizona Territory. 1879, the heavy church doors groaned open just past dawn, and the wind carried in more than dust and silence on the wooden pew near the altar. Someone had left a woman. Colson Grady stepped inside with his hat in hand and his boots dragging red dust across the floorboards. He had come to fix the roof for the preacher, but what he saw stopped him cold. She was slumped forward, breathing but still. A worn shawl hung from her shoulders and the hem of her dress was torn. She looked about 20, maybe a little older. Her hair, dark and tangled, spilled across her shoulder like it had not been combed in days. But her face, pale, bruised, and asleep, looked like someone who had not given up, just been left behind. Colson spotted the note pinned to her dress. His fingers trembled as he pulled it free and unfolded it. "Her name is Eliah. She has no one. Please be kind." He read it again, slower this time, then he looked at her. She had a split lip and dried blood near her temple. Whoever left her here had not even waited to see if someone would find her. Colson's jaw clenched. He looked back at the altar, then down at her again. "She's mine now," he said quietly. The words came without thinking, but they felt solid, true. She stirred then, groaning as her lashes fluttered. Her voice was weak, but she tried to sit up. "You're all right," Colson said, crouching beside her. "You're safe now." She blinked at him, confused, then winced and put a hand to her head. "What's your name?" he asked gently, already knowing it. "Eliah." Her voice cracked, dry as sand. "Eliah Rourke." "Colson Grady," he said, offering his canteen. "You're gonna be all right, Eliah." He helped her drink, slow and careful. When she coughed, he steadied her. When she tried to rise, he caught her before she fell. "There was a note," he said, voice low. "It said you got no one." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. "No one now." "Well," he said, lifting her with quiet strength, "you got me." He brought her back to his cabin a few miles west of town. It was small, just 2 rooms, but clean and warm. He laid her on his cot and stoked the fire. Eliah slept for hours, barely stirring. He sat nearby the whole time, whittling wood and glancing at her every few minutes. That night she woke again and tried to sit up. He helped her lean back against the pillow. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes glassy. He brought her stew, thin but hot, and waited while she ate. Her hands shook. "Can I ask what happened?" he asked softly. She looked down at the blanket. "I was with a man, thought he was kind. He was not." Colson said nothing, just waited. "I ran," she whispered. "He caught up to me near Tucson, beat me, took everything. Left me outside the church in the dark." Colson stood slowly, jaw tight. "You do not have to say more." "I was not sure I would wake up." He walked to the window, then back again. "You are safe here. That man will never touch you again." "I do not even know you," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Why would you help me?" He sat back down beside her, watching her face. "Because someone should have, and nobody did. Because I saw you lying there alone and I knew. You were not meant to be left like that." She looked at him, searching his eyes. "You do not owe me anything," he said, quieter now, "but I am not walking away." Eliah reached for his hand. "Thank you." He took it gently, then let her rest again. Days passed, and Eliah grew stronger. Her bruises faded, and she started walking around the cabin, helping where she could. She fed the chickens, swept the porch, and sat with Colson in the evenings when the sun dipped behind the hills. He gave her space, but he was always near. He built her a small shelf for her things, fixed the hinge on the washroom door, left wildflowers on the table without saying anything. One night she leaned against the doorframe, watching him chop wood. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. He shrugged. "Had a brother, lost him in the war. Folks died after. I never did take to town life." She walked forward slowly, her arms crossed. "You ever been married?" "No." "Why not?" He looked at her. "Never met the right woman." Eliah's lips parted like she might say something, but she only nodded. That night she stayed near the fire after he went to bed. She watched the flames for a long time, then went to the window and looked out at the mountains. For the first time in months, she did not feel afraid. A week later, Colson came back from town with a new dress and boots wrapped in brown paper. He set them on the table without a word. Eliah smiled when she saw them. "You did not have to, I know." She touched the fabric soft and blue, then looked up at him. "I cannot pay you back for any of this." "I am not asking you to," she swallowed hard. "You said I was yours." "I meant it." She stepped closer. "What if I want to be?" His heart thudded. He reached for her hand, slow and careful. "Then you are." Eliah did not let go. Her fingers stayed curled in his, and she leaned her head against his chest. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in quiet, finally not alone. The frost clung to the edge of the window panes by early November, pale and delicate like lace pressed against the glass. Eliah stood at the stove, stirring a kettle of beans with a wooden spoon, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her movements had grown steady, sure. She no longer hesitated before reaching for things. Her hair was brushed and pinned, her face no longer shadowed by bruises, but the quiet way she carried herself, watchful, measured, remained. Colson pushed through the door with a stack of firewood in his arms. He kicked his boots against the threshold and nodded once before heading to the hearth. "You always bring in more than we need," Eliah said, not looking up. He crouched and stacked the logs near the fire. "I'd rather have too much than run out when the wind turns mean." She set the spoon down and turned. "You think it'll be a hard winter?" He took his time standing. "The birds left early. Coyotes been howling more than usual down by the arroyo. Something's coming." Eliah stepped closer, drying her hands on her apron. "You've been through many winters out here, enough to know you don't argue with one." She picked up a tin cup and poured coffee from the pot. It was old and strong, the kind that sat heavy on the tongue. "What made you stay here, Colson? In this exact place?" He took the cup from her and leaned a hip against the table. "There's a spring not far from the barn. Always runs cold, even in August. That's rare out here. And I like the way the land settled open, but not so wide you feel swallowed." Eliah nodded slowly, then lowered herself into the chair by the stove. "It feels like a place meant for starting over." Colson didn't answer right away. The fire cracked beside them and the smell of beans filled the cabin. "I built this place for quiet," he said finally, "but I don't mind the sound of your voice in it." She looked up then, eyes meeting his for longer than before. "I never thought I'd feel steady again. You don't have to rush anything, I know, but I want to stand on my own feet." He set the cup down. "You already are." Later that afternoon, Eliah walked down to the wash basin by the shed. The cold water bit at her fingers, but she didn't flinch. Behind her, the wind stirred the dry grass and carried the scent of creosote. She watched a hawk circle high above the ridge, and for just a breath, she let herself believe she could belong here. She was wringing out a cloth when she heard hooves on the trail. She turned, eyes narrowing. A man rode slow into the clearing, his horse lathered and his coat fine enough to mark him as somebody from town. He dismounted and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, miss." Eliah straightened. "You're on private land." "I'm aware," he said. "Name's Willard Langley. I'm with the land office." Colson appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't greet the man. Langley nodded toward him. "Grady, I heard you'd taken a woman in. Thought I'd come check." Colson's voice was flat. "You got no say in that." "I got say in who's squattin' or tackin' up shelter without clear record. Folks been talkin', sayin' things ought to be looked into." Eliah stepped forward. "I'm not a criminal." Langley looked her over. "No, ma'am." "But women without kin tend to draw trouble." Colson's jaw locked. "She's got kin now. You're looking at him." Langley studied them both, then gave a tight nod. Long as she's not a burden on the county, it's no concern of mine. He turned and mounted again. Before he left, he glanced back. Still, best keep to yourselves. Not everyone's so inclined to kindness. They watched him ride off, the dust curling behind his horse. When the sound faded, Eliah let out a breath. He thinks I'm something to be pitied. No, Colson said. He thinks he can measure worth by paper and rumor. She looked at him. Why didn't you say more? Because you said enough. That evening, Eliah sat weaving thin strips of dried yucca into a basket near the hearth. Her fingers moved with quiet precision. Did you ever want children? She asked without raising her head. Colson didn't answer right away. There was a time I thought I might, but life took a different turn. Would you still? He looked at the fire, then at her. With the right woman. Eliah's hands paused. I was with child once. Before, Colson stood slowly. You don't have to explain. Yes, I do. It didn't survive. I blamed myself for a long time. He crouched beside her, his voice low. You don't have to carry that on your own. She looked at him, and there was something unspoken between them. Grief, yes, but also the first shape of trust that went deeper than safety. He took her hand, not to comfort, but to share the weight. We're not who we were, she said. No, he agreed. But we can be who we choose next. She leaned her head to his shoulder, and for the first time since arriving, she closed her eyes without fear. The fire crackled on, and outside the wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow. By late November, the first snow fell in quiet flurries, leaving a thin crust across the roof and a hush over the land. Colson stood outside before dawn, splitting the last of the mesquite logs into kindling. The air bit sharp against his skin, but he welcomed the sting. It cleared the fog of sleep from his mind, the way only cold and labor could. Inside, Eliah boiled water over the stove, her breath visible in the morning chill. She'd taken to waking before sunup, lighting the fire and setting out the day's work without being asked. There was purpose in her now, not hurried but certain. When Colson stepped back into the warmth, she handed him a steaming cup. You always drink it black, she said, studying the rim of her own tin cup. Never took to sugar, he answered. Makes my teeth ache. She nodded, then reached into the small tin chest by the wall and pulled out a folded cloth. I finished this last night, she said, laying it on the table. It's not perfect, but it'll do. He unfolded it. A patchwork of rough cotton squares stitched into a small quilt. Each square was a different shade, some from old shirts, others from flour sacks. None matched. Together, though, they made something warm. It'll do fine, he said, touching the edge. You've got a good hand. I didn't at first. Her fingers trailed the edge of the cloth. I tore through more thread than I care to admit. He looked up. You didn't give up. I've done enough of that in my life. Colson sat across from her. You ever think about what you'd want if things were different? Eliah tilted her head. Different how, if you'd had a say? If you'd started from somewhere softer. She traced the rim of her cup. Maybe I would have had a little store, nothing fancy, just dry goods, maybe a sewing corner. I used to watch the women in town who sold fabric rolls. They always seemed like they knew their place in the world. He watched her face, the way her expression shifted from wistful to something steadier. You still could, he said, her eyes lifted. Out here. There's a rail line coming west of Bisbee next year. More folks'll pass through. A store's not far-fetched, she shook her head. You think too much of me. No, he said. I think just enough. They ate in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't press or strain. Just the clink of spoons, the stove ticking as it cooled. Later that day, Eliah walked the ridge beyond the pasture, a basket on her arm. The snow had melted in patches, revealing coyote brush and stone. She gathered dried sage and a few sprigs of wintergreen, careful not to take too much from any one place. Colson met her halfway home, reins in one hand, a fresh killed hare tied to his saddle. "You're ranging farther," he said. "I needed the air." He nodded. "You're not afraid, not of the land." She paused, then added, "I used to think the world would always press in, that I'd never have room to breathe. And now," she looked at him, "now I can hear myself think." They walked back together, the quiet between them no longer empty. That evening she took down a tin box from the shelf above the wash basin. Inside was a folded slip of paper creased and yellowing. Colson noticed her holding it. "The note?" he asked. She hesitated, then passed it to him. He read it again, slower this time. "She has no one. Please be kind." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "I don't know who wrote it. Might have been someone passing through, someone who saw me and decided I wasn't worth the trouble." He folded the note and handed it back. "They were wrong." She looked at him then, clear-eyed. "I want to burn it." He nodded once. "Then we will." They stepped outside, boots crunching over the frost-bitten ground. Colson lit a match and held it steady while she touched the note to the flame. The paper curled, darkened, and turned to ash in her palm. She let the wind take it. When they went back inside, she didn't speak for a long while. But when she reached out and took his hand, her grip was firm. He didn't ask for more. He simply stood with her, the firelight warming the space between them. That night, as the wind moved low through the trees, he built a second cot beside his and laid the quilt she'd sewn across it. Not as a boundary, but as something offered, something chosen. And in the dark, she whispered, "I'm not afraid of being seen anymore." Colson didn't answer right away. When he did, it was quiet and steady. "You were never meant to be hidden." The sun didn't rise so much as seep across the sky that morning, pale and cold. Eliah sat on the porch smoothing a strip of buckram across her lap, stitching it into the hem of a canvas apron. The wind tugged at her braid, but she didn't lift her hand to fix it. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a thin column of smoke rose in the far distance. Colson came up from the lower pen, his gloves tucked into his belt, boots heavy with mud from the creek. "Someone's burning mesquite," Eliah said without turning. He stepped beside her, following her gaze. "That's the Dunn place. They clear brush this time of year." She nodded but didn't set her work down. "I want to ride out tomorrow," she said. "See what's beyond the ridge." Colson leaned a shoulder to the porch post. "It's rough country past there, not much but scrub and canyon and a trading post that shuts down come snowfall. I want to see it all the same." He studied her a moment. "You want company or you want space?" "I want to know what I can do on my own." He gave one slow nod. "Take the Dunn mare. She's sure on her feet." "I was going to." Colson didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth lifted just enough to show he'd heard her tone. He walked back toward the well, leaving her in the morning light with her stitches and her thoughts. Eliah rose early the next day. She packed salt pork, a heel of bread, and a small flask of coffee in a canvas roll. The mare stood still under the saddle, ears flicking in the cold. She mounted without help and didn't glance back as she rode out. The land beyond the ridge was sharper than it looked from the cabin. The trail narrowed quick, winding between coyote bush and jagged rock. She saw no other riders, only a jackrabbit that darted across the path, and a pair of buzzards circling wide overhead. By mid-morning, the wind shifted. She reined in just above a wash where the brush had been trampled flat. A broken horseshoe lay in the dirt, half buried. "Eliah," the voice came from behind, low but clear. She turned sharply, hand dropping to the small knife in her boot. A woman stepped into view from behind a mesquite. She looked older, maybe in her 40s, with a wide-brimmed hat and a rifle strapped across her back. "Didn't mean to startle you," the woman said. "You're a long way from town." "I'm not from town," Eliah said. The woman glanced at the mare. That Grady's horse. Eliah didn't answer. The woman stepped closer, but not enough to crowd. Name's Ruth Calder. I trapped near the bluff when the weather holds. Saw you riding out and figured you weren't just out for the air. I'm looking, Eliah said. For what? A place that's mine. Ruth nodded once. Well, ain't much out here that's kind to women alone. But there's a draw east of here with a spring and some wild onions. I camp there sometimes. Eliah shifted in the saddle. Thank you. Ruth looked at her a long moment, then took a step back. You look like someone who's had the world bite down and let go. That makes you dangerous in the right way. Eliah turned the mare without answering and rode east. She found the draw just past midday. The spring was shallow but clean, and the onions grew in tight clusters along the edge. She knelt, filled her canteen, and ate in silence. The sky stretched wide above, and for the first time she didn't feel like something that had washed up on someone else's land. When she returned late, the cabin was lit with lamplight, and Colson was mending a bridle strap by the fire. He looked up once, then back to his work. You see what you needed to? He asked. I saw enough. She hung her coat by the door and crossed the room to the shelf. Her fingers lingered over the tin box that once held the note, now empty. I met a woman, she said. She didn't ask where I came from. That's rare. She said I looked dangerous. Colson set the bridle down. You are. She stepped toward him, the lines of her face drawn in thought. Do you still mean what you said, that I'm yours? He rose slowly. Every word. She reached for his hand, her grip sure. Then I want to stay, not just until I can stand alone, but after, if you'll have me. He pulled her close, and this time she didn't hesitate. You're not just mine, he said. I'm yours too. She rested her forehead against his chest, her breath steady. Outside, the wind had stilled. The snow would come soon, but for now the world held quiet. And inside that quiet, two people who had been broken in different ways began to stitch something new, not out of what they had lost, but out of what they chose to build. The wedding was quiet. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, branches bare and reaching into a clear winter sky. Reverend Tallow from the mining camp rode up that morning, coat patched at the elbow, Bible worn from years of sun. He said the words slow, letting the stillness between them do half the speaking. Colson held Eliah's hands as if they were something sacred, something he'd never take for granted. She wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin he'd traded for weeks before, simple, the color of cream, with a line of hand embroidery stitched along the collar. Her hair was braided and pinned with a sprig of dried wild mint. No one else came. There was no music, no polished rings. But when she looked up at him, eyes steady and full of quiet knowing, there was nothing missing. Afterward, they shared stew and cornbread by the fire. Reverend Tallow declined the offered bed, preferring to return to camp before nightfall. When the door shut behind him, Colson turned and found Eliah already watching him. You sure about this? He asked, not out of doubt but reverence. I haven't been unsure since the day I burned the note, she said. I was just waiting for you to ask. He crossed the space between them, took her face in both hands, and kissed her like a man who knew what it meant to be given a second chance. They slept that night in the same bed, no hesitation, no ceremony beyond what had already been said. The wind moaned low outside, but nothing touched them inside those walls. Nothing pressed or clawed. They belonged there in the hush and the warmth, wrapped in the life they'd chosen. Winter settled deep. Snow piled at the eaves and the creek froze to a whisper. Eliah kept the hearth going, baked with lard she rendered herself, dried strips of venison Colson brought in from his hunts. She kept a tally in a worn ledger of every jar of canned peaches, every bolt of cloth, every trade made fair. Her handwriting was small and tidy, like her stitches. Colson spent his days cutting fence posts and shaping a new cradle from pine boards dried in the loft. He didn't say anything the day she told him, just laid a hand against her belly and bowed his head. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled when she touched his. "I was afraid," she said, "that I wouldn't be ready." "You're not who you were," he answered, "and neither am I." They planted carrots and beans in the spring and a second row of corn. Eliah built a small shelf on the porch and began sewing for the nearby ranch families, mending, hemming, stitching names into shirt collars for boys headed to school in Tombstone. She bartered for sugar, beeswax, and once, a spool of blue thread that made her smile for 3 days. In June, Ruth Calder came through again. She left a small tin of dried apples on the porch and carved her mark into the side of the shed, a half moon over crossed arrows. Eliah found it and smiled without saying anything. The baby came in early autumn under a harvest moon. A girl, with dark hair and lungs stronger than seemed possible from something so small. Colson wrapped her in the same quilt Eliah had stitched that first winter. They named her Laura, after Colson's mother, and the name seemed to settle into the walls of the cabin like it had always belonged. Eliah nursed her by the fire, humming low, a tune she didn't know the words to anymore. Colson would sit nearby, carving or oiling the rifle, never far from reach. He built a chest for Laura's things, small now but ready for more. On the girl's first birthday, they walked the ridge trail together, Colson carrying her on his shoulders. The wind rolled soft over the scrub, and the sky stretched wide above them. Eliah looked back at the little cabin, the garden now full, the porch swept clean, and the smoke rising from the chimney in even threads. "You ever think about what it might have been if we hadn't crossed paths?" she asked. "I try not to," Colson said, "because it didn't happen that way. And I'd rather spend my time with what is." She took his hand, her fingers calloused from work but sure in their grip. "I never thought I'd be someone who could build a life." "You didn't build it alone, I know," she said, "but I carried it with me, even before I knew what it was." Years passed. The land didn't soften, but it steadied. Laura grew with the kind of quiet strength that came from watching two people who had survived, then chosen to thrive. She learned to ride before she could write, to count seeds before letters. She knew the names of every ridge and every friend who passed through, even if they never stayed long. Colson and Eliah grew older, not fast but sure. In the evenings they sat on the porch, their chairs worn smooth, hands laced together. They didn't talk much about what came before. It had shaped them, yes, but it didn't define them. What mattered was the firelight and the sound of their daughter laughing inside, the rose in the garden, the full pantry, the steady roof. Love had come not as a thunderclap, but as a slow build, a hand offered, a meal shared, a silence held without fear. It had settled into their bones, into the land, into the very way they moved through each day. They had chosen each other. And every day since, they'd chosen again. When the wind picked up and the trees bent low, when the world outside turned brittle and mean, the cabin stood firm. And inside it, so did they. Together. Always.